In the annals of military fraud, few schemes have been as bold or as desperate as what Russian investigators discovered in the summer of 2024. Elite Russian paratroopers, including some of Moscow's most decorated war heroes, were systematically shooting themselves and each other to collect lucrative combat injury payouts. That's right, literally shooting themselves in the foot and presumably other locations on their bodies. The scale of the scheme was staggering, involving at least 35 officers from Russia's prestigious 83rd Separate Guards Air Assault Brigade, who collected almost $2.5 million in fraudulent compensation. This was done by abusing Russia's loose injury compensation policy at the time, where every injured soldier would receive 3 million rubles or about $37,000, regardless of the severity of the injury. In their case, however, none of the wounds would end up coming from Ukrainian bullets. Let's dig deeper into this shoot-for-loot scheme. The mastermind behind this audacious fraud scheme seems to be Lieutenant Colonel Konstantin Frolov, nicknamed the Executioner for his supposed sniper prowess. After being wounded, Frolov eventually admitted that his fellow soldiers shot him at his request, aiming to avoid vital organs, all to secure the payout multiple times. His partner in crime was Guard Colonel Artem Gorodilov, a commander whose previous war crimes in Bucha made him a perfect candidate for such moral flexibility. But the scheme to siphon money from the Russian government is practically a drop in the bucket when you consider the deeper implications, including the inherent imbalance between Russia's elite and government and its ordinary citizens who are signing up to fight for its so-called special military operation. First, let's go a bit more in depth about the actual scheme. All things considered, it operated with a precision and foresight that you could only call military-like, which is fitting considering who performed it. According to the United 24 media outlet that covered the story, all the perpetrators would use momentary lulls in actual fighting to fake their injuries. A soon-to-be injured soldier would direct their comrades to shoot them in the legs or even the body, carefully pointing to non-vital areas to avoid excessive blood loss. Under Russia's then-existing compensation model, this would have been enough to score them a hefty monetary package. Then, after they were treated for injuries, they would be redeployed and available to perform the fraud again. Frolov's method was particularly brazen. According to United 24, court documents regarding Frolov's detention show that he officially received 4 combat injuries during his service, wearing patches indicating 5 minor and 2 severe wounds in total. Considering his combat record, it suggested that he had more wound badges than actual wounds, which were used to build a reputation as an unstoppable warrior who kept fighting through multiple injuries. And the Russian state media ate the story up to fuel its propaganda efforts to the rest of the population. Russian state TV aired a segment portraying him as a noble officer who fought through injuries and even adopted a child he rescued from a bombing. The Defense Ministry and other outlets echoed the same false story. It's presumed that everything about Frolov's heroic image was manufactured, from his wounds to his humanitarian gestures, all in the effort to get more compensation and commendations. However, the scheme went far beyond individual greed. The self-inflicted wounds would also allow soldiers to take paid leave and receive priority medical care. Based on the injuries faked, higher officers of the 83rd Separate Guards Air Assault Brigade could recommend their soldiers for prestigious military honors such as the Order of Courage, one of Russia's highest decorations for acts of bravery. The conspiracy was eventually revealed by a whistleblower who alerted authorities in the summer of 2024. Frolov was arrested immediately in June 2024, followed by Gorodilov a month later. It would then seemingly take months to completely unravel the scale of the fraud, but Frolov supposedly wasted no time throwing other co-conspirators under the bus to get a plea deal with the government. But to understand why the so-called elite Russian soldiers would shoot themselves for money, we need to dig a bit deeper into the bizarre economic incentives Russian President Vladimir Putin's war has created. On paper, the compensation system Putin established as part of the special military operation was designed to make military service financially attractive, especially to people outside the major population and industrial centers. According to the rules implemented then, the government will pay out 3 million rubles, worth around $37,000 in August 2025, for soldiers injured on the front. This was an obscene sum of money, especially when you consider that the average monthly salary in Russia varied between 58,000 and 72,000 rubles, about $700 and $900, depending on the outlet. According to the actual decree, the 3 million rubles payout was first supposedly reserved only for debilitating injuries that would preclude them from further service. However, the Kyiv Post pointed out that this was broadened to cover any type of injury, even ones that could be treated and get the soldier back into service. And then you have to consider the mathematics from a regular soldier's perspective. A starting wage for contracted soldiers who volunteered for service was estimated to be around 150,000 rubles, $1,865 in July 2022. In 2024, this was later revised to include a lump sum payment for signing up, which could grow to 1.9 million rubles, $23,631 in Russia's Moscow region, alongside a generous salary of 5.2 million rubles, $64,600 per year, which works out to over 430,000 rubles or $5,300 per month. but this applied to the richest regions, where compensation stayed in line with the higher regional salary wages. Another report suggested that the monthly salary stayed at around 160,000 rubles, $2,000, for contract soldiers throughout Russia, which was much less but still at least twice the average salary. But that generous salary comes with a severe caveat. They might not survive long enough to enjoy it. Russia has incurred between 850,000 and 1 million losses in 3 years of war, from February 2022 to February 2025, counting both severely injured and dead soldiers. So someone might naturally be more inclined to find a way to maximize short-term earnings over a promise of a better salary in the long run. On the other hand, the mathematics were already a bit complicated by the Russian government and bureaucracy meddling in how the compensations were doled out. All the way back in 2022, soldiers were already going forward with reports on having difficulties obtaining the supposed presidential compensation for their injuries, with some stating that the military was delaying the payouts or undermining the injuries to avoid severity cutoff. And then there's the inherent disparity in Russia's military structure. Russia's military operates on a brutal two-tier system. A growing number of troops in Ukraine are contracted. They serve a 3-year term, receiving room and board as well as medical insurance. These contract soldiers are essentially professional mercenaries who joined voluntarily for the money. Below them are the conscripts who are completing mandatory military service and officially aren't supposed to be sent to Ukraine, but often end up there anyway. All men aged between 18 and 30 have to serve a year in the Russian forces, but conscripts don't enjoy the higher salaries, instead typically paid pocket money, to the tune of around 15,000 rubles or $186 per month, while being offered housing, food, and other necessities by the state. So men who are in the conscription age also have to balance the chances of being drafted for a war and being sent to the front line, while not being paid as much as a volunteer, which they could have become just a month before. This creates sort of a wicked game theory where there's really no good choice. Someone who's not in the military might get called up to fight without any compensation and be used as an expendable infantry in one of Russia's infamous human wave attacks. Contract soldiers have a genuine financial incentive to serve, but they also might have more to lose as they could get posted further into the front or be the first to be deployed in a bold, new tactic that might end up with them dead or captured. So when facing the choice between risking death in combat or collecting injury pay through self-mutilation, some might just choose the latter. And then the volunteers who join the army might not get to stay volunteers, as the Russian Ministry of Defense can evidently just renew a contract and send injured or even captured soldiers back to the front line. This is done by pressuring the soldier into renewing or having their last deployment be a particularly deadly part of the front line or be used in an assault wave. For the Russian military, the mathematics didn't work out in practice. The generalist compensation payout has created a state where soldiers with the most training, equipment, and most importantly connections have found a way to exploit their station by faking an injury. At the same time, the undertrained conscripts and new troops are being sent to their deaths by the thousands, and the Russian government then still has to pay millions of rubles to their families or find a way out of that payment as well. This resulted in Putin partially reversing course on the compensation package in November 2024. A public decree revised the compensation to be in the millions only for debilitating and disabling injuries. Soldiers with minor injuries will receive between 100,000 and 1 million rubles, $1,250 and $12,400, depending on how severe the injury was. Quite obviously, the new measures were seen as cost-cutting and ways to curb the already inflated military budget, which was suggested to account for 40% of government spending in 2025. Then the public reaction resulted in increasing the disability payout from 3 million to 4 million rubles, $37,400 and $49,750. However, with the change in how the compensation was distributed, this was still considered net saving for the Russian government. When you look at the government's spending, the change makes sense. The Russian government paid out about 3 trillion rubles, around $37 billion, in salaries and compensation to soldiers and their families between July 2023 and June 2024. This represents approximately 8% of federal spending, going directly to military personnel and their families, which is a massive drain on state resources. But deaths and severe injuries that preclude a soldier from returning to active duty are relatively rare. In World War I, you had 4 soldiers who could return for every casualty. In World War II, that ratio was 3-1. The Dupai Institute suggests that around 70% of all battle casualties in recent wars have been returned to duty, where an injured soldier could be successfully treated and returned to the front in a relatively short time. This means that under the new structure, the Russian government will be paying out nearly 100,000 rubles, $1,250, for an injury that might take a few weeks to a month to heal before sending the soldier back to the front line, versus giving them repeat compensation of 3 million rubles every time. Furthermore, this opens up soldiers to getting further bogged down in bureaucracy. While the new compensation packages were made in 2024, the list and classifications of possible injuries were seemingly copied from the late 1990s, with no regard for the drastically different scale and sort of war Russia is currently in. Furthermore, at the time, Russia was in a deep recession following the breakup of the Soviet Union, so it classified broken bones and other injuries as minor, to avoid paying out its law enforcement and military to save up on cash to be used elsewhere. This also puts the prerogative on medical professionals within the military to properly classify and advocate for the soldiers. However, they are also more likely to be pressured by the government to underreport the injuries and provide minimal treatment. It also opens up more avenues for corruption, which was already rampant in the Russian military and government as a whole. The timeline of the changes is also peculiar. October 2024 was considered the deadliest month since the start of the invasion, with figures suggesting over 1,500 losses per day, up from 1,100 in the summer of 2024. The changes also came just a few months after Frolov's fraud ring was exposed, indicating that Russia wanted to shore up against any would-be copycats in other squads. It can be argued that financial incentives have been crucial to Russia's military recruitment and retention strategies over the last 3 years. Scaling back these benefits signals that the system is becoming economically unsustainable for the Kremlin, so the compensation cuts weren't just about preventing fraud, but preventing the military from bankrupting the country as a whole. Additionally, the compensation changes have created a vicious cycle that reveals how desperate Russia's military situation has become. As the government cuts injury payments to save money, it simultaneously has to increase signing bonuses to maintain recruitment levels. Around 30,000 contract soldiers a month are joining the Russian army. By some estimates, this is roughly the same as is leaving the battlefield, but this barely maintains current force levels, let alone allowing for any major offensive operations. To maintain even these minimal recruitment levels, Russia has been forced to offer increasingly generous signing bonuses. Dozens of regions have raised payments for those signing up in recent months, with the one-off sign-up bonus reaching 3 million rubles in some areas. This resulted in many regions providing more in an upfront bonus than soldiers would get after being wounded, putting a more fair spin on wartime mathematics. Of course, there's a natural limit on how many people you can mobilize from any given region. Men joining the front means you have fewer workers for industries and manufacturing, as well as reduced potential for population growth for the coming decades. Additionally, according to the conflict intelligence team and iStories, roughly 30% of the soldiers die between 3 to 5 months after being called up for service. This means many soldiers are practically rushed through training, which would ideally take around 3 months, and then sent to die on the front line, only to be replaced with a fresh batch nearly immediately. Given the brutal treatment, massive casualties and systemic fraud plaguing Russia's military, there's another important question. Why haven't the rest of the soldiers revolted en masse? A foreign policy analysis identifies several factors that prevent revolt despite conditions that historically would trigger mutiny. First is the culture of systematic violence that permeates Russian military culture. The ongoing invasion of Ukraine, uniquely documented through widespread online coverage, reveals an ingrained culture of violence in the Russian military that perpetuates a brutal cycle of coercion and complicity. Soldiers don't rebel because the system has normalized brutality to such an extent that abuse is expected rather than resisted. Second, the financial incentives, despite their problems, still represent life-changing money for many Russians. Massive payouts to soldiers and the broader surge in wages during the past 2 years have created a paradox. While economic inequality has deepened, many Russians feel that their standards of living have improved. Even soldiers facing death have family members benefiting financially from their service. By some accounts, a total payout for a soldier who volunteers for service, earns a salary for a few months, and then dies in combat would earn about 8 to 10 million rubles, $99,500 to $136,800 for their family. According to a 2018 study, this is similar to what Russian economists valued a life of a middle-class Russian citizen, which was between 7.9 and 10.5 million rubles, $98,300 and $130,600. As such, someone from a poorer family basically ensures their family gets what they would earn over an entire life in just a few years. In a milder scenario, the generous sign-on package plus the higher-than-average salary would set up a soldier ahead for later in life, plus give them the ability to qualify for subsidized living expenses with cheaper apartments and other benefits. The economic dimension creates a particularly insidious trap. Previously, they had nothing, and now they can change cars, they can pay their loans or afford mortgages, and surveys indicate growing perceptions of a favorable distribution of wealth and economic improvement within the country. The war economy has created a class of people whose prosperity depends on continued conflict. Third, the decentralized nature of the fraud schemes, such as the one uncovered in the 83rd Air Assault Brigade, suggests that individual units have found ways to game the system rather than confront it directly. Rather than organizing collective resistance, soldiers have developed individual survival strategies, including shooting themselves, that allow them to extract benefits while avoiding the most dangerous aspects of combat. Finally, there's the simple fact that the soldiers with the most capability to organize resistance are often the ones who benefit most from the current system. They're more likely to be like Frolov, organizing and participating in fraud schemes than leading a rebellion against them. The absence of meaningful resistance extends beyond the military to Russian society as a whole. Despite massive casualties and obvious corruption, Russian women, who historically have been crucial in ending unpopular wars, seem to have largely supported Putin's war effort. Remember, in 1917, they famously took to the streets to protest food shortages in the monarchy, sparking the strike that eventually triggered the Russian Revolution. More recently, the Committee of Soldiers' Mothers of Russia was likely instrumental in pressuring then-President Boris Yeltsin to end his war in Chechnya in 1996. But the current war presents a different dynamic. The financial benefits of military service have created what amounts to a war economy that many Russian families depend on. Alternatively, some women have started pressuring their husbands or sons to enlist to get more benefits in the future. And while the state heaps praise on these men in death, in life it seems to view them as disposable. Russian officials have made this abundantly clear, repeating the cliché of "women will give birth to more." Even Putin has urged women to focus on childbearing, while Russian Health Minister Yevgeny Shestopolov suggested they could attempt to conceive children during breaks from work. Of course, we can't be fully certain of how much this is due to the fear of retaliation from the government, which has historically cracked down on public dissent with lengthy prison terms. Perhaps most damning, when we go back to the scheme in question, Frolov requested to be sent back to the front rather than stand trial, but his request was denied. Even when facing serious criminal charges, he preferred the risks of combat to the consequences of the fraud, a telling indication of how Russian people viewed the relative dangers of Ukrainian bullets versus Russian justice. But the Russian families themselves are faced with choices that should never have been offered in the first place, as the war has been going on for far too long to make any initial compensation package make economic and financial sense. This is precisely why 2024 saw attempts to rectify this by changing them to be more dependent on sign-ups and salary rather than injury and death. And rather than conducting a comprehensive review of compensation practices or improving oversight mechanisms, the government simply changed the payout structure to make fraud less profitable. This suggests the primary concern isn't preventing future fraud, but controlling costs, no matter how many actual lives and families are being ruined in the meantime. The story of Lieutenant Colonel Konstantin Frolov and his co-conspirators represents the logistical endpoint of Putin's war economy, when military service becomes primarily about financial gain rather than national defense, when propaganda replaces training, and when individual survival becomes more important than unit mission. Armies stop functioning as military organizations and become something else entirely. While this is a betrayal of these men's fellow soldiers to their chain of command and to their country, we can't help but note that it's also a sign of declining morale in the Russian army. The willingness of elite soldiers to shoot themselves rather than fight indicates that soldiers simply no longer wish to be in a war that might get them killed for nothing. The most damning aspect of the entire scandal may be how easily it operated for so long. Investigators say the scandal exposed systemic abuse of Russia's military reward programs and gaps in internal oversight. Given that Frolov was hailed as one of Russia's heroes for so long, it stands to reason that there are probably others like him who abused the compensation but just restricted it to one-time use to avoid further scrutiny. Putin's response of changing compensation rules, rather than addressing underlying military dysfunction, suggests that the Russian elite views this as an accounting problem rather than a military culture problem. But when soldiers prefer to shoot themselves rather than trust their training, equipment, and leadership to keep them alive in combat, the problem goes far deeper than compensation formulas. In the end, the most honest thing Lieutenant Colonel Frolov ever did may have been asking his fellow soldiers to shoot him. It's a perfect metaphor for what Putin's war has done to the Russian military as a whole. Even his nickname, the Executioner, fits what Putin is slowly doing to the country. Thanks for watching. If you'd like to learn more about why Putin started a war he can't seem to finish, check out this video. And to stay in touch with the most recent news on global geopolitics, subscribe to The Military Show for daily videos.